A biblical perspective on life, culture and current events. This is 2020 on Vision.
Let's turn our attention to some of the developments that are happening in the nation of Israel. And as you know, Israel has been at war with Hamas since the massacre of 1,200 Israelis on October the 7th last year. Well, speculation about what might lie ahead include a revived call for a two-state solution. Well, we're back today with filmmaker Hugh Kitson, who's behind the multi-series production of Whose Land. He helps people understand the history of conflict, exposing the lies and demonstrating the truth about Israel and the land that they sit on. Hugh Kitson, a special welcome back to 2020.
Well, it's wonderful to be with you and a privilege to be able to talk to you from the other side of the world.
Hugh, let's talk about Israel, because calls for a two-state solution, those question, don't they, even the right to sovereignty of Israel. And if you believe the propaganda that's being disseminated around the world, there are a lot of things that are being said that might not hold the sort of truth that you have researched now over many decades. What should we think about Israel and their right to sovereignty?
Well, although we don't deal with the biblical right to sovereignty in Whose Land, and that's mainly because we're aimed at a secular audience, we certainly look at the legal aspect of it. And the original part one, we look at the legal foundations to the State of Israel, going back to the San Remo Resolution of 1920 and the mandate that followed it. And the mandate is an international treaty. All of the mandates were. There wasn't just the mandate for Palestine. There were three others in the Middle East. And there were mandates in Africa and also in the Americas, in the Mid-Americas as well. And they're all binding in international law in the sense that the intended beneficiaries were to be recognized as the beneficiaries. And this was carried forward from the League of Nations when that was dissolved into the UN Charter. So you've got that legal foundation to start with. And the mandate itself recognized the Jewish connection to the land, which at that time was called Palestine. So its historical connection was in the foundation of the mandate document, as well as their right to reconstitute their national home. So that's the start. Now, come 1948, with the War of Independence, and Britain had actually violated the terms of the mandate on almost every single level, you get this invasion from the 5 Arab armies. And according to the UN Charter, to invade another country certainly with the intent of destroying it or taking it over is a violation of international law, in the same way that Russia invading Ukraine is a violation of international law. And Britain was actually complicit in all of that. Britain backed the Arab invasion and certainly the Jordanian annexation of Judea and Samaria, which they renamed as the West Bank. So you've got this history which is basically ignored. Now, today, when you look at the Middle East conflict, that history is ignored, and the clock starts in 1967, when Israel recaptured Judea and Samaria, her biblical heartland, her historical heartland, and of course all of Jerusalem, and then established Jerusalem as her capital city. So basically what part 2 of Whose Land looks at is the principles of international law that allow Israel sovereignty over all of that territory, which is the God-given land of Israel.
As you point out, the ignorance of history is there for all to see, and you've been monitoring this and working with this and researching this now for decades. Give us an idea of the extent of the documentaries that you have produced up to this time.
Well, most of the documentaries I've done on Israel, and actually my first ever visit to Israel was in early 1974, January 74, so that's 50 years ago, and that was just after the Yom Kippur War. After that, we made a film called The Last Generation, which is really looking at God's time clock in the restoration of Israel in relation to the return of his son, Yeshua HaMashiach. So that was really the beginning. But and I did a few other films, but the last 25 years, I've been concentrating exclusively on Israel, and we did a film called Jerusalem, the Covenant City, that was released in 2000. I've done a number of documentaries for Ebenezer Operation Exodus, and then 20 years ago, because at this time of the year we remember the Holocaust internationally, I did another film called Lest We Forget, which looks at the Holocaust. We've got interviews with Holocaust survivors, but then we look at the rhetoric that led to the Shoah, the Holocaust, which sadly is something that's not very often included in Holocaust education these days. And then we make the comparison between the venom and the Jew hatred and Israel hatred that is coming out of the radical Islamic world, including the Palestinian Authority. And we've recently re-released Lest We Forget, because anti-Semitism is now, Jew hatred is now at a high that's not been seen since the 1930s and 40s.
We're going to come back to talk more about your films in just a few moments, but let me ask you your insights, perhaps even predictions, for those unfolding challenges that are coming this year, 2024, for the Israeli people, in the midst of the circumstance they're in now, threats coming from all sorts of different directions. Any thoughts from you as to what might be ahead in the coming months, perhaps through this next year?
Well, what the October the 7th massacre opened up, and by the way, Hamas coded the name of their so-called operation the Al-Aqsa Flood, and I think that this has very visible ramifications all over the world. We have seen on our streets demonstrations, Jew hatred demonstrations, like we have not seen ever seen before. Certainly not since the lead up to the Second World War. And it seems to me that what is happening in the nations, because this is going to affect the nations, is that we're seeing an Islamic revolution, on our streets. And Palestine in inverted commas, is the icon for the whole thing. Now, I just want to say something about Palestine. The people today known as the Palestinians do not have a history. Yes, they're real people and they need to be accommodated, and international law gives them the right of self-determination. And actually, the Oslo Accords gave them that right of self-determination, and it has been squandered and become iconic in the destruction of Israel. So we're seeing, I believe, actually the lead up to the Lord's return. I mean, the prophetic scriptures talk about the nations coming against Jerusalem. Well, we haven't seen that in a military sense, but we are certainly seeing it politically and spiritually, and certainly in the United Nations.
So the screening tour that you have in your mind, potentially for here in Australia, early part of February moving into March, there's possibilities there. So you're about to complete this series, or you're just on the verge of getting this next series done, with the plan to turn this into something that can be featured in cinemas. What are your thoughts here about bringing your screening tour to Australia?
Well, there are certainly the Australian Jewish Association is shown interest in doing this. This would be part 2 that we're about to complete. We've done quite a lot of work on a potential part 3 as well, which I'll mention in a moment. But part 2, as I said, looks at the legality, and people don't understand this. So it may not be until sort of southern autumn that we're able to do this, because we've still got to complete this final episode of part 2 first, and it takes a while to organize these things. So it could be a bit later than February, March, might be April, May sort of time.
So it's sometime soon, and you'll be looking to have cinema screenings. And for those who have got real interest in what's happening right now with the developing issues in the nation of Israel, a good place to start with understanding the history is to check on those Whose Land series that you've produced over now many years. For listeners to be able to access those, you can find them on YouTube. So YouTube, simply search for Whose Land, WHOSE Land, Whose Land. It's youtube.com/@ Whose Land. And as you say, that'll be part 2. Aspirations too for part 3 in a series. I imagine you looking for a few friends, a few backers. How does that work?
Right. Well, we have actually shot quite a lot of material for it, but we still need to raise some money to do part 3. And the working title of that, well, the title would be Two-State Solution ? And the question mark, of course, is very important. Now, with all of the what's been going on in their education system, what's been going on for 2 or 3 generations now of young Palestinian children being brought up to hate the Jewish people, to hate Israel, and to be promised that one day Israel will disappear, and if necessary to become shaheed or martyrs in doing so. This has been going on for 2 or 3 generations, and we highlight this in the film Lest We Forget, which I mentioned. Well, that film was made 20 years ago, and you see Palestinian children being trained to kill Jews. Quite probably the terrorists that invaded Israel back in October were probably those children now grown up. Now, part 3, Two-State Solution, will look at the background. Where did the Palestinian entity that we know today, where did that originate? How did it originate? What are the goals behind it? Because it's not just Hamas in their charter that calls for the eradication of the Jewish state and the murder of all Jews, but certainly the eradication or the destruction of the Jewish state, Israel, and ongoing, well, their charter says through armed struggle. An armed struggle, of course, is terrorism. And what we're seeing with pay to slay in the Palestinian Authority is they're outworking their charter from 1964-68 to this very day. And what is so alarming is that the nations of the world completely ignore this. And yet they're calling for a state solution.
So how do we address that ignorance? Let me point listeners to arm yourself with background history and information. our special guest is Hugh Kitson, a filmmaker who's behind the multi-series production of Whose Land. You can access that on YouTube. Just simply Google Whose Land on YouTube or go to youtube.com/@whose-land. Hugh Kitson, look forward to seeing you when you're in Australia. All the best with the production of Series 2, and I know that you're looking with an aspiration for Series 3 already. Thanks so much for sharing these thoughts with us today on 2020.
Thank you very much, Neil, and God bless you all.
Thanks for taking time to listen to this audio on demand from Vision Christian Media. To find out more about us, go to vision.org.au.